Good evening. This is Dan Perkins, and welcome to Two Guys from Verona. And tonight I want to talk about the president's visit to the kingdom.
I'm Don Mazzella, and I want to talk about why Americans don't trust the media anymore. Dan, do we have a special guest today?
Yes, we do. He's a Vietnam War veteran with the Purple Heart, but we'll have more about him later in the show.
It's time for Two Guys from Verona. Each week, you will hear from Dan Perkins, a financial expert, a regular columnist for the Hill website, and best-selling author, and Don Mazzella, a veteran journalist, author, and radio host talking about things that concern you politically, financially, and socially. They will also try to give listeners a heads up on future happenings. We start off each program with Dan Perkins' essay on what he considers an important issue facing us.
Well, as I said at the opening, I want to talk about the president's trip to the kingdom. You know, one of the advantages or disadvantages, depending on your perspective of doing live radio, Don, is that things change so rapidly. The best laid plans of mice and men have to wait for another week. This is a hot story all over the news about the president. And I did an interview this afternoon, and the gentleman asked me, are you expecting two things? Are you expecting the president to bow before the new king? And two, do you think there'll be any discussion about what's going on in the United States vis-a-vis the 28-page document and the legislation pending before Congress? And I said, I'd probably put money he's going to bow before the new king, because if he bowed before the old king, it might be disrespectful from one Muslim to another Muslim not to bow to the royalty. And he said, are you saying he's a Muslim? I'm just saying he bowed once before, he'll probably do it again. As it relates to the issues that are more important to us and whether or not the president bows to the king, I wrote a piece that should be out sometime this evening. And I raised the question as whether or not Saudi Arabia was trying to blackmail the United States. The Saudi family has told the president in no uncertain terms, if the 28-page document is released and the legislation is passed that allow America's victim survivors to sue Saudi Arabia, they will sell $750 billion worth of assets, thinking that they might be able to do something to the U.S. economy. Now, that causes me to ask a couple of questions. For example, why are they so concerned about the 28-page document? Have they seen it and they know that it's not good for them? Number two, the idea that terrorist nations can be sued under a 1976 act is still on the books. In fact, it was the basis for a win of about $10.5 billion when Americans were suing the Iraqi government, who was at the time classified under the State Department as a state sponsor of terrorism. The question is whether or not the State Department and the president will classify Saudi Arabia as a state sponsor of terrorism. One has to wonder, 19, Don, of the people that were on the flight that took the flights down were from Saudi Arabia, and their families have been well taken care of by the royal family and the Saudi government since 9/11. I have grave concerns whether or not the president will, in fact, trying to intimidate the Congress to not pass the legislation that will allow the 28 pages to be released, and two, whether the Congress will support the bill that would allow Americans to sue not just Saudi Arabia, but any nation that's declared to be a terrorist state for the loss of a loved one. It seems to me that, as one reporter put it tonight on the Fox News, the president is between a rock and a hard place. Because if he decides to defend Saudi Arabia, he risks alienating people on both sides of the aisle and in the country. Why is the President of the United States choosing Saudi Arabia over the American people? So I think it's a really difficult situation I think we have the right to know what was on those 28 pages. We paid for them. We paid for the commission. And I think if the Congress wants to pass legislation, let the process go through. Now, I heard the Speaker of the House, Ryan, has a little bit of a problem with that legislation on litigation, but he did say that it needs to be discussed. So I think it's all over the news along with the New York primary, but it seems to be the most hot topic of discussion. Any thoughts, Don?
I wanted to take it 4 steps back.
Four?
Number one.
You want to start
4.
over from the beginning again?
Well, you've got at least 6 or 7 steps, so I'll go back 4.
Okay.
For far more important, whether the $350 billion is relatively speaking, a drop in the bucket, and it might be an excuse for the Saudis to sell assets, as you have pointed out, because the price of oil has dropped so precipitously over the last year, and that might be a cover story. That's number one. But number two, more importantly, the Saudis are very, very upset. If you saw the New York Times story in today's Times about how the Saudis feel, they really feel abandoned because they have done a lot of things for us over the past half century in the Middle East, and they've been extremely helpful. They were at one time our most reliable ally in the Middle East, but President Obama has managed in the last 8 years to fray that alliance to the point where it no longer exists, and they're going to go their own way. As I've said to you many years ago, French troops were necessary in order to contain a rebel attack in the holy city of Medina, which is held in Saudi Arabia, or Mecca. Having said all that, whether he bows to the new king to me is less important as to what he's trying to accomplish. Unfortunately, according to my sources in Washington, he doesn't have an agenda. You do not go to a foreign country without an agenda. If the agenda is only what you're saying, bowing to the king or preventing legislation, we're in trouble. The Saudis Sunday, as you know, failed to get agreement to cut the price of the production of oil. They're losing out to the Iranians. They're adrift. And instead of reaching out a hand, it appears our current president is letting them sink, which is a mistake that will come back to haunt us. I'm back to you, Dan.
We need to go to commercial break. We'll be back to continue the discussion with two guys from Verona.
Welcome back. You're listening to Two Guys from Verona. Once again, here's your hosts, Dan Perkins and Don Mazzella.
Well,
Dan,
Don,
tell us about our. Go ahead. I was just going to ask you to tell us about our guest.
Right.
While we get him on the line.
Yeah, we're trying to get him on the line. Chuck Baker was introduced to me. He is he's a Vietnam War veteran with the Purple Heart, and he's done a lot of work in radio and television. And he spent a good bit of time over the last several years in putting together a documentary film to help us understand what it means to be in the Army in Vietnam and what it means to come home. And so it's important that, as you know, because of our foundation working with PTSD, Chuck is the kind of person that gives us an opportunity to have a direct insight from a man who served there and who understands the plight of the soldiers when they come home. Are you there, Chuck?
I am here. Good evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you for calling in. Sorry about the confusion. So tell us a little bit about yourself, and then let's talk about your movie.
Well, I'm a Vietnam veteran, and served early on with the 1st Infantry Division, otherwise known as the Big Red One.
Right.
And was wounded, got a Purple Heart, with a few million other guys. But and then I've worked in veterans areas over the years. As a journalist, I've been a reporter, a writer, an editor, a photographer, and I've worked with all the veterans groups, and I edited a veterans newspaper for many years here in Las Vegas, and I still write for several local publications on veterans issues, and I do a radio show every week here in Las Vegas. We work with, we interview a lot of different people, including veterans and government people and charities and nonprofits and things like that. But a lot of our guests come from the veterans community.
Yeah.
So then I don't know, a few years ago, speaking of the documentary I produced, I was doing a TV show, and it was 100% veterans oriented, and I was interviewing veterans, and I realized virtually all the veterans I interviewed from different wars and different time periods, and men and women, and they all were successful in some way. They started business when they got out of the service. They started businesses, or they went to school, or they worked for companies and had a career, raised families. And then opposite of that, when you pick up the mainstream media, a lot of the mainstream media, you see all this negative stuff about veterans having PTSD, and they're unemployable, and you got to watch out for this and that. And of course, there are some unfortunate veterans that way, but certainly it's a small minority. Right. So I felt I took a lot of these interviews that I did on TV. Those were the core of the thing. And then I went out and interviewed other veterans specifically for this documentary. And I also got the input from the various veterans groups, the Tgfv and the American Legion and the various services and the VA. And I put together a documentary. It's called Veterans, a Motion Picture. And it's all the veterans that I interview, like I say, from different wars, different periods. They were all successful in one way or another. Some were super successful, but some were just, led good, positive lives, raised families and whatnot. And I just think that message needs to get out, that most of our veterans come back from service and they do fine. And even those who have PTSD, most of them, with medical help and psychological help, they can overcome that PTSD. Right. And unfortunately, there are a few, I don't mean to denigrate the fact that there are a few who can't be helped. There's no doubt about that. Yeah. But they are such a small minority. So that's the whole project. It's called Veterans, a Motion Picture, and it's available at my website, which is veteransreporter.com. And they can order it there. And I just hope you and other people that I talk to can help spread the word that veterans are very employable, very trustworthy, very dedicated. They know how to follow instructions, and they can get the job done. I want to give you a couple of examples in my own personal life with the foundation that I have called Songs and Stories for Soldiers, which helps deal with PTSD and more specifically sleep deprivation. I did a presentation in Dallas, Texas. Mm-hmm. I've been traveling a lot, and the gentleman who was the photographer who was taking pictures throughout the evening came up to me and asked me if I could step out in the hallway. And I said, sure. He said, I work full-time as a professional photographer. I have PTSD, and I do have a problem sleeping at night. Do you think your MP3 player could help me? And I said, well, first thing is it can't hurt you. It doesn't help everybody, but if you'll give me your name and address, I'll send you one, and let's see if we can't get you some sleep. So you're right. There are a lot of people that have PTSD on a daily basis and do function and hold down good jobs and make a good living, but they still fight with the PTSD. The other thing I wanted to bring to your attention was what I thought was one of the most fascinating discussions, and I literally wanted to ask you this particular question. I was at a veterans hospital, and there were two veterans talking. One was a veteran from our war, Vietnam. I was in the service but didn't serve overseas, and another one from Afghanistan. And the veteran from Vietnam said to the other veteran from Afghanistan, he said,
when we came home from the war, we weren't very well received, and we took a lot of anger and frustration, and a lot of abuse. But we survived it, and we went on. When you went to Vietnam, you might have done a tour. You came back home for an extended period of time, and you could volunteer for a second tour. Today, because of the shortage of military resources, we're sending soldiers into 4, 5, 6 deployments with very little decompression time. And he said, the guy from Vietnam, that's one of the reasons why I think there's such a much higher level of PTSD, is that we just wring these men out and women, and they have nothing left to give when they come back, and they take a long time to readjust. I know that the Army has, and the Department of Defense is a better say, we've worked with several of them, of the warriors in transition units around the United States, where there are soldiers who've had a difficult time assimilating back into society, and they go to this, they stay in the Army, they stay in these barracks, and they get help so that they can hopefully assimilate. I'm curious, as you interviewed these veterans over the various wars, did you find any striking things that made them different from one generation to the next?
Well, yes, I did. Maybe not quite in ways you describe. One lady in particular who served in Vietnam and came back, and she says actually in the interview that when she tried to get a job back home, that she felt the Vietnam stigma was holding her back, that she wasn't getting job offers. So she didn't. What she finally decided to do was, the way she explained it, is she'd go for a job, and she wouldn't even say that she'd been in Vietnam. And, back then, when we didn't have computers and internet and Google and all that stuff and Facebook, and so you could get away with that, a lot more easily. Right. So she just left her Vietnam service off of her resume, and very soon after she got hired, and she stayed in her job for many years. Yeah. So that was certainly a distinction that nobody could really get away with that today if they,
Don, we got about a minute and a half. Anything you want to ask, Chuck?
Well, I was going to say, having been in Vietnam, the thing that I felt made Vietnam different was that the units did not rotate out together, but individuals rotated, and that left a lot of veterans without a real support system at home. Did you find that in your reporting, that became an issue?
I didn't find it as an issue. Now, in my case, of course, I didn't rotate out on a regular basis. I rotated out because I was severely wounded, and they had to send me back to the States for medical treatment. But for the most part, while I was there, my guys their EPS didn't even come up, their separation, and so we were all together there, until the time that I left unexpectedly. But nobody's really brought that up. The people that I have spoken with, and even now that I talk to, nobody really brought that up. I did actually. There was a Marine group that had a big convention here in town a few years ago, and I did interview several of those gentlemen, and they were all Vietnam vets in the same unit, whatever Marine unit they were. I'm an Army guy. I don't remember the Marine unit, and they seemed to have stayed together, and they even stayed together in contact after they got home, and they had this huge reunion here with almost all the veterans who were still around showed up. They just had a real camaraderie. I think Marines have a little more camaraderie maybe than Army guys.
That's probably true. Well, Chuck, we have to move on, but please give us your website again.
It's veteransreporter.com.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your service, and thank you for joining us on Two Guys from Verona, and we'll be back in a little bit.
Welcome back. You're listening to Two Guys from Verona. Once again, here's your hosts, Dan Perkins and Don Mazzella.
Dan, I want to talk about something that's very disquieting. it seems that some respected surveys have shown that the American people are losing their faith in the media. It's very interesting. The number as low as 6% believe what the media says.
Right.
This is, to me, a very troubling. As you well know, I've been a reporter and editor for over 50 years,
That
and
long,
in
huh?
that time,
That long?
that long, I can tell you, 1962 was the first time I started
Wow.
at NBC News.
You are an old
And
guy.
yeah, and I've seen a lot of changes, but it's interesting about it. Then, then a story would not be put on the airwaves unless it was vetted, unless it was true. There was a reasonable feeling that what was being said was true. I can use as the example the fact that Dan Rather got a scoop at President Kennedy's assassination because the rest of us at NBC, ABC, even CBS were waiting for the Merriman Smith, who was then the dean of the White House staff, news reporters, to tell us the president was dead. Dan Rather went ahead and built a career on it. But that's the exception that built a career. Right now, we have people doubting what's being said. And to some extent, they're right to doubt because we have 24/7 news hours. We have bloggers. We have people. There is no oversight about what's being put out there. It's interesting. About 5 years ago, the news agencies were all worried about the fact I don't have anything go out on my under my name or my company without at least two people checking it. And we still use that old adage: when in doubt, leave it out, because it's better to come back later. But that's the way it's changed, and unfortunately, it's cost the American public dearly, and more importantly, it's cost the media because we've lost our readers' trust or our listeners' trust. It's not going to get any better. We're seeing increasingly divisive channels. People who watch Fox believe one thing. People who watch CNN believe another. People who watch MSN believe something else. That's not the way. News is designed to inform and let the individual make the choice. That's not what's happening. What do you think, Dan?
Well, I'm as you were talking, I'm reminded of probably in my lifetime the first time the American television news got something wrong. And I can still see this in my mind today, and even though I'm not quite as old as you, it was a long time ago.
Dan, you're old whether you want to recognize it or not. But anyway, my wife says we got to stop doing this because it hurts us both.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll see. Anyway, do you remember a reporter for ABC News by the name of Frank Reynolds?
Of course.
Frank Reynolds was on the air, and he reported on the air that John Kennedy had been killed. He died. And then, within moments after he said that, he came back on and they said, no, he wasn't dead. And Frank Reynolds says, will somebody get the damn thing right? So clear back then, we had potential for the desire to get first with the news, not necessarily the most accurate. I look at what's going on, and as you and I talk today, there are a number of examples, whether it's Brian Williams at NBC News, who was the anchor on the NBC Nightly News, who lied about his escapades during conflicts, whether it was NBC News who doctored the 911 tapes on the Trayvon Martin case, whether it was ABC News who doctored the crash tests, and whether it was Dan Rather who got his career because he said the president is dead, who was caught basically reporting false information about George Bush's his record in the military. There seems to be, over time, two things that have been prevalent in my mind. The press is clearly electronic press. Mainstream media is clearly biased towards the Democratic Party and Democratic candidates. And the number of journalism majors who are reporting the news has diminished rapidly. And I think that we have created a new category of news readers who are no longer reporters, and they read the news that's put in front of them. But I think that the news media has also become extremely politicized and has been for many, many decades.
Well, I disagree with you in terms of decades. Let's look at this and let's talk about it. Don't forget, when I started, anybody that worked in media and television had to have had experience in a newspaper. I couldn't go from copy boy to news writer until I went out to a newspaper. And newspapers then, less so now, but still the point, as John O'Hara, the novelist, said, reporters get to see people at their heights of their lives and the depths of their lives. And what more can you ask for? But newspapers teach people to be careful, to be sure, not to make mistakes, and if you do make mistakes, own up to it. The problem has been we don't hold people as accountable then as we did now. I remember my journalism professor explaining why he had left the WOR radio, because he walked into a live broadcast and cursed. He didn't know they were live. So what he did, turned around, he took his hat from the hat stand, they wore hats in those days, and walked out the door, never to return. That doesn't happen today. We forgive people, we forgive their errors. Newspapers today still acknowledge their mistakes. Television does not. Brian Williams still has not publicly acknowledged that he lied. If you watch it, NBC has never acknowledged that they lied. CBS has never acknowledged. It's all the same. And interesting you mentioned Frank Reynolds. The unfortunate part was Frank Reynolds was right. It's just that his superiors, his news editor, the person he was responsible to, would not admit it because we hadn't heard it officially from Merriman Smith. Mm-hmm. So until we heard it from them, we couldn't say it. And that's the frustration.
Wasn't there a situation, it's been a number of years ago, but maybe 10 or less, where a New York Times reporter won the Pulitzer Prize on a false story?
Oh, Washington Post reporter.
Washington Post?
Wrote the Washington, of course. But she made up this fictionalized version of a street kid, and she was forced to get. It's just the anniversary of it. Glad you picked it up. Well, look at the University of Virginia. The story of this woman who claimed she was raped and it went into Rolling Stone. And if you read the Rolling Stone mea culpa at the time, it's a breakdown because anybody along the line, any editor, would have seen the holes in the story. The problem is we don't have good editors anymore with the power to use the pen.
Are you saying that in general, the editors that would work at most mainstream newspapers aren't doing their job as they used to?
There are less of them. They don't have the time. I can remember, and I still prefer to have an editor look at my stuff. A good editor will make a reporter a great reporter because they will catch things, they will ask questions, they will do an editor is, and I'm talking really a copy editor, is the people's mind. He or she is the person that sits there and says, does this story hold water? Is it balanced? Should it be in our newspaper? Should it be on our television? Don't forget, in the glory days of NBC News, which I was a part of, nothing went on the air until it had gone through to an editor and the chief editor before, and that included Chet Huntley and David Brinkley. It all went through there. They all had editors, and everybody caught things. To this day, just today, I caught somebody caught something on what I had written. That's what's wrong with media today. There's simply no one checking. You have great latitude. It's a shame because if you can't keep a secret if there's two or more people, but more importantly, you can't make a mistake if two or more people see the same story.
So, but in the case of the examples where we talked about with, excuse me, with, for example, Dan Rather and his reporting with on George Bush, are you saying there was...
No one messed with Dan Rather's copy but Dan Rather. I quote that from someone inside CBS. No one said Dan Rather, hubris will get us all at some point. Whether you're a reporter, whether you're an editor, whether you're an author, or whether you're a president of a company. You and I see it every day. Hubris is the key. That's why a good editor will really keep down the hubris of any reporter.
So what I read all the time about newspapers closing and magazines closing and the some, I forget who it was, I just read recently, had tried to survive by creating an online edition, and nobody was looking at the online edition. And so are the print media as we know them today, the Newark Star, Ledgers, and the New York Times, are they destined to go away?
Absolutely, in some way, shape, or form. They will survive, but who knows? The New York Times has, 400 reporters? There's no other organization, not even the Wall Street Journal, which I consider the best newspaper in America. They're all, at some point. It's a shame. I hope I don't see the death of newspapers, but it is coming. You and I read. I read the New York Times every day online. It's unfortunate because then I can pick and choose what I see. Mm-hmm. I read the Wall Street Journal, the print edition, because it's the little kernels that you get in the back pages that turn into the stories you and I follow.
So you don't see that on the online edition of the Wall Street Journal?
No, you don't, because you don't. You don't see it on the online edition of the New York Times.
Okay.
There's much to be said for going through. Besides which, we used to say years ago, you can't take a computer into the bathroom. Remember that?
Now you can with a laptop.
Yeah, but it's still weighty.
Yeah. We need to take a break. We'll be right back. Thanks for listening to the guys from Verona.
In this final segment, Don and Dan offer their predictions on what's going to happen in our world.
Okay, partner, you're up.
Okay. Well, yeah, as we speak, the New York primary is winding down to a close. I think they close at 9 o'clock.
Right.
I happened to be passed by a polling place today, and the line stretched around the corner. Why? Because all the machines were broken. There's a lot of irregularity. Remember, primaries in New York for the last 25 years have been generally pro formas, and nothing happening in terms of presidential. But this one is important. And so knowing that Dan would ask me the question, I've been kind of talking to some of the people I know, seeing what the exit polls are saying. I myself do not believe in the strength of them, especially this one, because I've heard two contradictory stories. One is that Bernie is going to squeak by a victory. The other is that Hillary Clinton is going to win in a walk, and somewhere within is the truth. My own feeling is that Bernie Sanders will poll about between 45 and between 44 and 47%. If he gets above 45%, you got a whole new ball game, and there's a lot of people that will be quaking in their boots about this whole issue. Because if Hillary Clinton can't, take her own state in a walk against Bernie Sanders, and by the way, his rallies were more raucous and wider spread than hers. She did all of her rallies in closed spaces. He did most of his rallies in open spaces, and he drew bigger crowds.
Right.
So that's what we got to look for. Dan?
Well, I was going to do one thing, but let me follow up on yours. There was an emergency meeting today in New York City in de Blasio's office because these were closed primaries. Only Democrats could vote in the Democratic primary, and only Republicans could vote in the Republican primaries. Independents could not vote in either one. Apparently, in Brooklyn, 300,000 names disappeared off the voting rolls on the Democratic side. They didn't know where they went, and they couldn't find them. I'm curious as to, with the impact of lines around the building, will they keep voting open past 9 o'clock?
Of course.
And if they do, that means it's going to postpone somewhat the outcome. However, I'm curious as to what's going to happen as it relates to the impact on your polling data. If you have more voters, does that favor Bernie over Hillary or Hillary over Bernie? I don't know that particular dynamic over there. But when I was doing an interview this morning about New York, I said, and the other side of the story is how Cruz is manipulating delegates to vote, to try and get them to vote for him on the first or the second ballot after they're obligated to vote for Trump on the first ballot. And I was thinking about that today, and I did an interview this morning, and I said, let me suggest something for everybody to think about. How is it possible that anybody in their right mind could say that Hillary Clinton, if she's the candidate, and I know you believe she's not going to be, but if she were, that Ted Cruz can beat her when Ted Cruz is probably going to finish third in New York. He didn't do well in Florida, and he didn't win in Ohio, and he may not win in California. How can you think that you can beat Hillary if you can't win those key states? And I think that nobody's talking about that yet. They seem to be, the press, your guys, seem to be enamored with this strategy that Cruz has come up to try and pick off Trump's delegates on the second ballot. What happens if by the end of June, before the Republican convention, Trump, between what he has and the delegates who are not committed to any one particular candidate, he gets the number. So he's got his 1237, and he walks in the door of the convention in July, and he's got the 1237 locked up. He's got the nomination. What happens to Cruz's people? What do you think, Don?
No, well, that's a good question.
Long one, but a good one.
Well, firstly, the assumption is he walks in the door, which, again, I doubt. But if he does, what always happens at a convention, once the nominee's in, everybody's going to rush in to make it unanimous. What people forget, most Americans have never been to a political convention. And it's a rare, I don't know if you've been, Dan, but it is an experience never to be forgotten. I've been to a few, and I always see at the end of it, even though there's bitter fighting, and this may not be the case here, at the end, people walk out and say, our man has a chance, or in this case, our man has a chance. Let's go and see. Let's try to get him elected. That's how it's been. There's a really great movie called The Best Man with Henry Fonda.
Right.
People should really see that movie to understand about the political convention, because it's closest I've seen on film. And at the end, whether it's Trump, Cruz, Ryan, or Kissick, at the end of the convention or somebody else. The Republicans are going to come out of the convention unless Donald Trump is dumb enough to try to be an egomaniac and try to destroy the Republican Party. Whoever comes out of it will be the clear favorite if Hillary is the nominee, and the definite favor of whoever else the Democrats may put up. And I keep saying, Dan, this primary season is not over, nor is it will be over until the convention.
Did you happen to see the interview with Joe Biden on the train this past weekend?
No.
Joe Biden is talking to a reporter, and he says, you know, I got higher approval ratings than anybody running for president, meaning Republican or Democrat.
Right.
And he said that. And so it's just amazing to me that he's not running, but he's letting people know that should things go bad, I mean, I think he would like to try and run. I don't know. I still think Ryan, if he's going to have any credibility longer term, if he says he doesn't want it, he's not going to be there. But I do think that the Democratic Party is going to be in trouble if Hillary's not the candidate, because I just don't see the vast majority of Americans even considering Bernie Sanders as a serious candidate. I mean, I heard Maria Bartiromo say today in Times Square that they asked her to do an analysis of the cost of Bernie's program, and she said it would destroy the GDP of the country. Look, we're out of time. Good talking with you, Don. This is Dan Perkins.
And Don Mazzella.
For Two Guys from Verona. If it's important to you, it's important to us. And if you've got subject matter you'd like us to talk about, send us an email at host@twoguysfromverona.com, and we'll see you next week.